From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Thursday, July 9th, 2015. Is San Francisco really a sanctuary city? In the wake of a fatal shooting allegedly by an undocumented immigrant, we'll speak with Supervisor John Avalos, who authored the Due Process for All ordinance. And we'll feature the next episode in the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum series with Heidi Boghosian. Plus, filmmaker Matthew Heineman joins me in studio to discuss his astounding new documentary, Cartel Land, about border violence and the resistance to it. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has released a grim report this morning on the Syria war. It found that more than 4 million Syrians have left their country since the conflict began in 2011. The staggering number is the largest in 25 years, comparable to the exodus of Afghans in the early 1990s. Neighboring Turkey is bearing the largest brunt of the refugee crisis. The 4 million number does not include a whopping 7.6 million internally displaced people inside Syria. UNHCR head Antonio Gutierrez said, quote, "This is the biggest refugee population from a single conflict in a generation. It is a population that needs the support of the world, but is instead living in dire conditions and sinking deeper into poverty." Chenjerai, these are heartbreaking statistics. Do you think the world is paying enough attention to the Syrian tragedy?
Well, I really hope so. I mean, as you pointed out, this exodus is the biggest refugee population from a single conflict in a generation. And the rate at which this is happening is also troubling because it indicates we may not have seen the worst of it. And this is something that people are talking about in Jordan and Turkey. This also has to be understood in the context of mass displacement. The UNHCR has warned that the world is now experiencing what they call an age of unprecedented mass displacement, with 1 in every 122 humans on the planet being a refugee. Another thing I just want to point out quickly is that, humanitarian aid is going to be crucial in the short term, but in the long term, we're going to have to find ways to address the wealth disparity and create systems that can actually handle large populations and distribute the wealth in a sustainable way. In Turkey, for example, what we see is that, wealth disparity has grown, with the top 1% now accounting for 39% of the nation's wealth.
The Union of Concerned Scientists has just released a damning report on how fossil fuel companies for years have known the risks of climate change and worked actively to deceive the public. The report, entitled The Climate Deception Dossiers, is a collection of secret documents and memos over a 27-year period from companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, Shell, and more. They were obtained from a variety of Freedom of Information Act requests, lawsuits, and whistleblower leaks. The 85 memos, numbering a total of 330 pages, have been made available online for public view. They reveal that fossil fuel companies actively spread disinformation about climate change and that such deception continues today. Well, if fossil fuel companies, Chenjerai, knew that the planet was in danger of warming but hid it, it kind of takes the wind out of the sails of climate deniers, doesn't it?
Well, Sonali, it should, but climate change denial is shown, to be incredibly persistent when it comes to new information and reasoning and ethics. In 1998, ExxonMobil formed this global climate science team. And looking over the report from the Union of Concerned Scientists, I was struck by how thorough Exxon was about, just how clear they were about the role of CO2 emissions in producing climate change, and also how explicit their plan was. One section of the memo reads, quote, "Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand and recognize uncertainties in climate science, and when public recognition of uncertainty becomes part of the conventional wisdom." So it's just really unfortunate.
Finally, the South Carolina State House in Columbia may be just days away from doing away with its most prominent symbol of racism. The State House voted yesterday on a bill to remove the Confederate flag, 93-27, just days after the Senate did the same. Republican lawmaker Jenny Anderson Horn garnered news headlines after making an emotional plea to her colleagues, saying, quote, "I cannot believe that we do not have the heart in this body to do something meaningful such as take a symbol of hate off these grounds. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley is expected to sign the bill into law today or tomorrow. Haley wrote on her Facebook page, quote, "It is a new day in South Carolina, a day we can all be proud of, a day that truly brings us all together as we continue to heal as one people and one state." The flag may come down as early as tomorrow, just weeks after activist Bree Newsom was arrested for physically removing it. Now, Chenjerai, you're in South Carolina. Are you worried that lawmakers will feel like they're done dealing with racism now that the flag is likely coming down?
I am worried about that. This is a complex issue for me. This weekend, my wife and I were at the Take Down the Flag protest in Columbia. And, many people who are quick to dismiss this as like a symbolic gesture, but living here, it's hard to watch that flag fighting and flying in the air. And I'm sensitive to how Southerners have had to deal with that in a way that you haven't in the rest of the country. At the same time, I'm deeply worried about what's going to happen after this. South Carolina has real issues we have to deal with. We don't have a hate crime law. We're number one when it comes to domestic abuse, which affects disproportionately brown women. We're one of the poorest states. Our education is at the bottom. So, you kind of have a sense that maybe the conservative politicians are looking at like they're going to take this flag down and maybe not take as firm action on other areas. So I'm concerned.
Well, Chenjerai, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Chenjerai Kumanyika is our Thursday Daily News Flash guest expert. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll go to San Francisco to find out about whether that city is truly a sanctuary city for undocumented immigrants, as some in the right would like us to believe. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Just over a week ago, a young white woman named Kate Steinle in San Francisco was shot to death in broad daylight along the Embarcadero. The suspect in her shooting death is an undocumented Mexican immigrant named Juan Francisco Lopez Sanchez, who, according to reports, said he found a gun wrapped in a shirt on the pier and it went off in his hands. Sanchez is a multiple felon who reportedly re-entered the U.S. without papers several times and was on probation in Texas when the incident took place. In an interview on local television, he claimed he returned to San Francisco because he knew he wouldn't be turned in to immigration authorities. Sanchez's statement has been turned into the focus of a major right-wing media campaign to denounce what are being called sanctuary cities in the U.S. Not only is Bill O'Reilly calling the victim, quote, collateral damage to the insane far-left politics of San Francisco, but Democratic lawmakers like Senator Dianne Feinstein are joining in. Feinstein said, quote, we should focus on deporting convicted criminals, not setting them loose on our streets. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I'm looking at whether additional federal legislation may be necessary. Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has thrown her opinion into the mix. She said the city made a mistake not to deport someone that the federal government strongly felt should be deported. So I have absolutely no support for a city that ignores the strong evidence that should be acted on. All of this comes at a time when presidential candidate Donald Trump is under fire for accusing Mexicans of crimes such as rape. The timing of anti-immigrant rhetoric predictably rises during election campaigns. Mr. Sanchez's case is reminiscent of the infamous 1986 Willie Horton incident where conservatives employed racist stereotypes to influence election-time public opinion. Joining me now live from San Francisco is John Avalos. He is a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors representing District 11, and he authored the Due Process for All ordinance. Welcome to Uprising, John.
Good morning, Sonali.
Thanks
Good
so
to be
much for
here.
joining us. Now, is this term sanctuary city really accurate? What exactly does the ordinance that you authored and that was passed say?
Well, San Francisco, back in 1989, we passed our sanctuary city ordinance, which said that we wouldn't use city resources to collaborate with immigration officials. That was in '89. In 2013, the city united around the Due Process for All ordinance, which I authored, which basically said that we would not honor ICE detainer requests unless there are certain exceptions around violent felonies where we would have discretion to honor ICE hold requests.
Now, the claim that Mr. Sanchez was in police custody, but because San Francisco is supposedly a sanctuary city, he was released. That claim, is that what really happened?
I can't really speak to how that happened. There are many sanctuary cities in the United States. San Francisco happens to be one of them. There are also many cities and counties around the country that have a similar policy like the Due Process for All ordinance. There are about over 300 of them, including San Diego County, Orange County, Santa Clara County, Alameda County. Very common, especially after the federal court case in Oregon, Miranda Olivares versus the Clackamas County. That ruling said that ICE hold requests are unconstitutional, that they actually violate people's constitutional rights because they're not based on probable cause. And after that ruling that was made in March of 2014, hundreds of localities around the country decided that it wasn't worth the risk to actually honor most ICE hold requests.
So when the right claims that that San Francisco broke federal law, that they violated federal law, is that accurate?
It's inaccurate. Our federal law around how immigration operates is broken. And if by law, if we wanted to really honor the request to hold people beyond their release dates, then the feds would need to provide us with a judicial warrant. That's the new standard that's been put in place by the courts. And so that's what the law we operate on.
Now, this term sanctuary city has been focused on a lot in the last few days, and it implies, and the right-wing media is implying that undocumented immigrants can go to a sanctuary city like San Francisco, do whatever they want, and we'll find a safe haven. Is that at all accurate?
It's completely inaccurate. There are places that cities that provide sanctuary status. In a lot of places, the majority of places don't. And you'll see, obviously, there are 11 million people who are undocumented in the United States, and they're scattered throughout the country, places where there's documented sanctuary city status and places where there aren't. And you look at the places where people are, they go where they find opportunity. Often they leave countries that are torn apart by, often the policies that are made on the global level by countries like the United States. And they come here and other countries that have greater opportunity. And they're all over the place. They're in our Central Valley, they're in Wisconsin, Minnesota.
And if they break the law, they're treated like anybody who breaks the law would be, right?
They are. In fact, our law enforcement here in San Francisco will prosecute undocumented and documented people and citizens alike. And they go through their court system as if they had the same responsibility for upholding law and being accountable for the laws. And they go through our courts, and people do their time, and they're released when they've done their time.
As far as you know, was Mr. Sanchez treated any differently than a legal resident would have been in terms of being on probation, etc.? There's this sense that he was released from prison, from police custody when he should have been kept in police custody. But if he was a legal resident, he would have gone through the same thing that he went through, right?
Well, he actually was held here past his release date by a couple of weeks. So, in fact, we didn't quite abide by the letter of the law for the Due Process for All ordinance. And all of us in San Francisco united on this ordinance, from the police chief to the district attorney, to the mayor, to 11 members of the Board of Supervisors who unanimously said that we would, except under certain conditions of violent felonies, we would not hold someone past their release date. There were no exceptions to that, and that was what we all had agreed upon.
And Mr. Sanchez has not been imprisoned or convicted of any violent felonies prior to this, so that makes sense.
I don't believe he's ever been convicted of a violent felony.
Yeah, he has some
What he had in
drug-related.
San Francisco was a 20-year warrant for marijuana possession or sales. It was a felony 20 years ago. Now it will be a misdemeanor.
So let's also step back and talk about how important it is to have such an ordinance that San Francisco has that you authored and that was unanimously passed. It's essentially the crux of the matter is that law enforcement shouldn't be cooperating with federal immigration authorities because that is detrimental to public safety. Is that essentially it?
That's exactly right. And we had like I said, unanimity here in San Francisco among our city departments, the mayor's office, the mayor himself, and the Board of Supervisors recognizing that we really have to separate local law enforcement from immigration enforcement. Combining the two together actually creates a real barrier for immigrants to actually take part in helping law enforcement as witnesses, or if they're victims, even reporting crimes that they've been victimized by. Often you have witnesses who are undocumented, who see a crime that happens to someone who perhaps is a citizen, and that witness might not come forward lest they get caught up in the justice system, which happens very, very frequently. You take that barrier away, and a lot of people are willing to come forward and be active participants in helping to law enforcement do their work.
Now, how much pressure is San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee coming under over this ordinance?
Mayor Lee's under a lot of pressure with this ordinance, and every member of the Board of Supervisors is under a lot of pressure. And the person who has the most pressure, because all the fingers are pointed to him, is the sheriff of San Francisco. And it's a very political effort that's behind those fingers pointing at him, when all of us, from the mayor to the Board of Supervisors, the police chief, really played a role in crafting the due process for all ordinance and making what it was. According to the ordinance, the sheriff didn't have any discretion on this, is that this person had a very low-level offense and was released when charges were dismissed, and he was following the letter of the law.
Now, the family of Kate Steinle is mostly staying out of the political discussion, saying that they want to heal. And I can't imagine, of course, what they're going through in losing their loved one. But do you think the right is taking advantage of this particular case because of the racial dynamics here? You know, a young, pretty white woman shot in broad daylight by a brown-skinned, undocumented immigrant, whether or not it was some kind of vicious targeting of her or an accident, which Court of Justice will reveal, Court of Law will reveal. But these dynamics are a sort of perfect storm that can be taken advantage of by the political winds.
Right. There are a lot of political interests that are at play here. Certainly there are people who, like Donald Trump, who were running for president of the United States, Hillary Clinton, and they want to make themselves appear that they're going to be making the country a more difficult place for immigrants, that immigrants don't belong here. There's a whole scapegoating of immigrants that's going on. And what they're doing is they're taking this one incident of a very horrible, tragic event, the killing of Kate Steinle, and saying this represents all immigrants, and we have to do everything we can to prevent this from ever happening. They're putting this causal relationship between our policy and the killing of Kate Steinle, when there are so many other things that are at play: the availability of guns, prevalence of guns on our streets, our overall immigration policies, and they're using this one focal point to really push their own agendas.
And I'm really glad you brought up the issue of the availability of guns. There's news now that the gun that was used in this case belonged to a federal agent. It's not really known where it came from. Mr. Sanchez says that he found it wrapped in a shirt on the pier. But thousands of people are killed by gun violence in the United States every year. thousands. This one incident is being seen as indicative of this huge problem of crime by immigrants. But in fact, such cases are outliers, aren't they? There have been studies showing, there's one that I found, Ruben Rumbaut, a sociologist at UC Irvine, who studies criminal immigration trends. He told the Huffington Post some years ago, studies that I've done based on census data, studies along the border, government commissions from 1994 to present, have repeatedly found the same thing. Immigrants are associated with much lower rates of crime and incarceration, and some of the safest cities are those with large immigrant populations. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's just how we have reality and facts and what the data shows, and how people are just trying to distort this one event to be able to cast all immigrants in a certain way to push their agenda, whether their agenda is actually racist, anti-immigrant agenda, or one that they're going to use those attitudes that exist in this country to advance their political careers. It's a politics of triangulation. When you think about our people who are running for president of the United States, Hillary Clinton herself has come out against policies like our sanctuary city policy and due process for all policy. They're not looking at the facts, but they're just actually trying to put their own statements out to appear tough on this issue.
And just let me re-quote Hillary Clinton. She said, "The city made a mistake not to deport someone that the federal government strongly felt should be deported." There are, I think, several inaccuracies in that statement. First of all, the city of San Francisco isn't doing the deporting, can't do the deporting, right?
We have no ability to do any deportations. This person was actually in federal custody in the prisons of the federal prison system, and actually the feds have the ability to deport him. He's also been deported a number of times already, and it's clear that the process of deportation is not one that's working. Not to say he shouldn't have been deported because of his status, and he was in the prison system of the feds, but it goes much deeper to like why is immigration an issue? Why are people coming to the United States? What are the factors in place that create conditions where people come across this country? Those are completely ignored, and of course those are two difficult questions for politicians to really deal with.
Finally, Mr. Avalos, this is standard, sort of like clockwork, political issue that comes up election time, and this next election campaign cycle has just started so early. Are you at all surprised that the right is jumping on this issue, and of course Democratic lawmakers who claim they're on the side of immigrants but often end up being even harsher?
I am not surprised, and it's just really unfortunate to see it happening. I really think about how Kate Steinle's family is reacting to all of this. They just want to be able to focus on, coming together in their grief, and this is being all blown out of proportion. They've asked for it not to be politicized the way it has. I was talking to my mom the other day, and she lives in Massachusetts, and she said, this reminds me of Willie Horton.
Yeah.
And I was like really struck by that. And clearly, it's just how the Willie Horton ad was used to tap into a chord that exists in this country about unresolved issues around race, and in this case, immigration, that is being used and politicized in a way to advance people's political careers.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today and shedding light on this issue.
Pleasure to be here.
John Avalos is a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors representing District 11. He authored the Due Process for All ordinance. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. As part of an ongoing series of interviews for the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we'll turn today to Heidi Boghosian to explore the links between government spying and corporate invasions of our privacy. The CIA, NSA, and the Pentagon rely on outside contractors to do much of their work, but what if big corporations could use them as well to spy on activists opposed to their actions. Corporations aren't bound by the Constitution like government agencies are, and therefore they aren't required to honor the same rules when it comes to surveillance. Produced by Brave New Films, the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum features my interviews with a number of academics, journalists, and activists. Henry A. Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the United States. He served under FDR and ran for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket and was known as the champion of the common man. Today's guest, Heidi Boghosian, is a lawyer and executive director of the A.J. Must Memorial Institute. She also co-hosts the weekly radio show Law and Disorder on Pacifica Radio's WBAI in New York, and she blogs for the Huffington Post, and her book is called Spying on Democracy: Government Surveillance, Corporate Power, and Public Resistance. How do you know when the national security state has gotten completely out of control? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali. The NSA, Pentagon, and other security agencies rely on outside private contractors to do a lot of their work. Those companies have become experts in spying on U.S. citizens. That's scary enough. But what if they now had new clients? What if big corporations could use them to spy on activists opposing their harmful actions? Heidi Boghosian is a lawyer, radio host, and executive director of the A.J. Must Memorial Institute, which has focused on supporting nonviolence and social justice since 1974. She has defended several people against this type of spying, and she now joins us from New York. Welcome to the program, Heidi.
Great to be here.
Well, can you begin by telling us what the relationship is between the private security sector and the national security state here in the United States?
U.S. intelligence agencies and the private sector in this country work so closely together that they're virtually indistinguishable. They share resources, they share personnel in terms of really a revolving door between government leaders of these agencies who then go to work for the private sector, then come back to work for government, and often advise the president and the national security leaders on policy and who to contract with. So it's rife with conflicts of interest and really blurred lines between the two sectors.
Now, do the same regulations that apply to national security agencies of the government also apply to private contractors?
Private corporations aren't bound by the U.S. Constitution. So the kind of spying, the in-depth monitoring that they can and do conduct on activists and ordinary Americans is really without oversight and without the kind of rules that government intelligence agencies are supposed to follow.
And how do private companies influence our laws and our policies? One of the institutions that we now know today is quite active and has been active over the years is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is an organization that influences legislation at the state level by being able to meet directly with state representatives. And some of the policies that they recommend that are then implemented, passed and implemented, involve national security. So how much influence do they have in crafting our policies and our laws?
ALEC has an enormous amount of influence. They actually draft model legislation, so they will put their full force behind getting legislators to approve laws that they draft. We've seen state laws, anti-terrorism laws, that have also passed on a federal level, such as the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And I think the danger is that when you have corporations writing our laws and doing so because they have a vested interest in protecting their bottom line, for example, it's very easy for them to target lawful activities of Americans, but to craft it in a way that makes ordinary activities such as leafleting or boycotting an industry that, say, treats animals inhumanely, they call that terrorism. And I think that's an enormous danger when it's motivated by a for-profit company who's not accountable to the general public.
Now, we know today that the national security framework is used at all levels to justify all sorts of infringements of our rights. Local police departments, for example, are spending a lot of money on national security related enhancements to their police equipment and how they go about gathering intelligence. Tell us a little bit about this sort of mini industry that is built up in local police departments. How lucrative is it? How much funding do they get? And does that funding in the end go back to the very same private companies that write the laws requiring these sorts of things?
After the events of 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security created many incentives for local police departments across the country to apply for grants to really bolster their police departments, whether it be by adding equipment, in some cases military tanks, as well as other funds that they could then keep and sort of make permanent in their departments if they identified local terrorism threat assessments. And what we saw across the country were departments really rushing to come up with threat assessments. In many cases, there were websites by law enforcement that encouraged people to identify local activists and any kind of event that might attract a diverse group of people to call that the potential for terrorism. And we saw over $34 billion being poured into police departments for that kind of thing.
Tell us a little bit about so-called fusion centers. A lot of Americans don't even know what these are, but they exist around the country post 9/11. What are fusion centers and how do they fit within this network we've been talking about?
Well, between the years 2003 and 2007, the government realized it really had to step up its efforts to coordinate and streamline intelligence gathering. It was criticized for how it handled the events of 9/11. There was a lot of waste in government and no transparency. So they created fusion centers, and there are about 73 across the country. But what they do is they again streamline the sharing of information between law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and again, the private sector, big business.
On the issue of how activism can be targeted, let's look at the example of the Occupy Wall Street protests. That was a very large mobilization of activists around the country. And in that case, how did private security companies cooperate with local police departments and the national security state to spy on these activists, to undermine their work?
A month or so actually before the first Occupy encampment in New York, the Department of Homeland Security actually knew about it and started reaching out aggressively to financial institutions and banks in New York City and also across the nation. Word quickly spread, and the Department of Homeland Security started monitoring activists who had been active before and who I believe they suspected would be active in Occupy. And it's worth noting that there was a concerted effort really to keep the media out of the several times when police went in and shut encampments down in New York in the middle of the night and elsewhere around the nation. I think it was because they shared intelligence so effectively, even those just camping out on the streets in front of their banks, but also to share that database with others across the country in a well-coordinated effort.
What is the danger to a democratic society when you have a national security state that punishes dissent, that undermines free speech, and that works in such close concert with private companies?
The danger is that anyone who acts differently, who challenges the status quo, who may engage in a creative form of protest to get a message out, is labeled and stigmatized as a would-be terrorist. Often, ordinary activists going to what we call national special security events, such as the Republican National Convention, the Democratic Convention, are targeted months before they go to such event because law enforcement has records on them. Their homes may be visited by the FBI asking questions of friends and family. Their offices may be visited. And what happens is it has what we call a chilling effect on the exercise of free speech. People become afraid when they know the FBI has visited their home of what might happen, or if a friend is arrested without probable cause, as we see happen all the time, merely because they are exercising their right to engage in free speech protected activities. So I think the danger is that we veer much more toward a police state than many may recognize is actually happening, and that we're encouraged never to challenge mainstream thought or to have an original idea of our own, because to do so may label us as an outsider or a different person who becomes suspect.
Heidi Boghosian, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, thank you.
We know the NSA has listened to our phone calls and spied on foreign leaders. But how did the NSA get so powerful in the first place? Find out in our next episode.
NSA is created in absolute secrecy. Even its name was top secret, and there were only a couple people, I think no more than 2 people in Congress, that were even allowed to know it existed. So it was born in absolute secrecy and has remained that way most of its life.
Heidi Boghosian is a lawyer and executive director of the A.J. Must Memorial Institute. She also co-hosts the weekly radio show Law and Disorder on Pacifica Radio's WBAI in New York and blogs for the Huffington Post. Her book is called Spying on Democracy, Government Surveillance, Corporate Power, and Public Resistance. Next Tuesday, we'll play my interview with James Bamford on the history of the NSA as part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The rise of drug cartels in Mexico that has gone hand in hand with the U.S.'s war on drugs has claimed tens of thousands of mostly Mexican lives. A new documentary by U.S. filmmaker Matthew Heineman gains unprecedented access to the cartels, their victims, and those who are fighting back. Cartel Land, which is releasing in theaters around the country, profiles the autodefensa groups inside Mexican towns. These are self-defense community groups that have taken up arms to defend themselves from the narco violence since law enforcement and military authorities have ceded power to the cartels and often work with them. Heineman pointed his cameras at meth cooks, grieving mothers, an armed doctor, and a white Arizona vigilante in painting a complex and vivid portrait of the violence at our border. Cartel Land is executive produced by Academy Award winner Catherine Bigelow. I spoke recently with the film's writer, director, and producer, Matthew Heineman. Welcome to Uprising, Matthew Heineman.
Thanks for having me.
So your documentary has a feel of more of a feature film than an actual documentary, and that's likely because of the almost like unprecedented access that you had to various parts of Mexico and the southern United States border. You open your film with a very ominous scene of a group of Mexicans literally cooking up a giant batch of meth in the cover of the dark. Tell us about this scene and what some of these men told you about why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, so Cartel Land is about these 2 different vigilante groups, one in Arizona, one in Mexico, who are fighting back against the Mexican drug cartels. And in the case of Mexico, we filmed in the state of Michoacan, which is a state that's been ravaged by the Knights Templar cartel. That cartel is known for many things, but cooking meth and extorting the people, from everyday tortilla makers to multinational corporations. And so, I think one of the things, from my point of view, is to really get in there and get into a meth lab. It is really important. Most of the meth that we consume in the U.S. comes from Mexico, much of that from Michoacan, much of that from the Knights Templar. So from the moment I stepped foot down there, I really, really wanted to get in there. And I spent almost every shoot talking to somebody. Do you know somebody? Know somebody? Know somebody? And then finally, halfway through shooting, we got a call saying, we think we can get you in, and it was a false lead. And then after spending so much time, I kind of gave up on it. And it was on our final shoot, about 9 months into filming, that we got a call saying, be in this town square at 6 p.m., and we're going to take you in. And so a group of masked men drove us through these small towns and smaller towns and fields. And then they stopped in the middle of the field and said, "We're here to provide protection." Another car drove at us and drove us into the lab. And I'd always dreamed of filming the scene. Excuse me. And I'd always imagined it being this sort of like halogen lit trailer.
Watching too much Breaking Bad?
I'd actually never seen Breaking Bad,
Okay.
but I just sort of, that's what I imagined. And, when I got there, it was pitch black.
Yeah.
And I don't shoot with lights, and so that's a bit of a problem. And so the head chef, the head cook of the meth lab, started showing me around, and with this little flashlight, that I lit the scene.
When one of the men started speaking, he sort of admitted that he felt bad about the fact that, this was meth that was going to the United States and didn't feel good about that, except for the fact that this was a positive option to poverty. And I thought that was a remarkable statement to make that sort of frames or underpins a lot of what's happening at the border. People do what they do, are driven to do what they do because they don't have access to decent lives like we might at the northern side of the border. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I say in that opening scene, I would love to travel the world like you.
That's what he says, yeah.
Yeah, but for them, they're farmers. They're cultivating a crop. It just so happens that the crop is meth. It just so happens that the crop makes its way northward and ruins a lot of people's lives. But for them, they're just getting by.
And then you cut to Arizona, and this white vigilante group led by a very interesting man named Tim Foley, whose group has been labeled a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and who believes that he is protecting the U.S. border from dangerous drug cartels. How did you gain access to Foley, and how did he explain to you what drives him?
I read about his group in Rolling Stone, and I spent several months sort of gaining his trust, gaining access to him, and I told him, I want to come down and document what you're doing, and sort of embed myself with your group for a long period of time. And, I knew nothing about the border. I knew nothing about vigilantism. I knew nothing about the drug war. And so that's where the film started, with this vigilante group on the Arizona side of the Mexican border, fighting, quote unquote, to protect America. And
so your story started with this vigilante group?
I first started in Arizona.
Why were you drawn to them? I mean, honestly, just from, just looking at them as something that the SPLC describes, my radar goes up and instantly I judge them as a white supremacist type hate group that is basically trying to nab as many undocumented immigrants as possible because they have the right to point their guns at them.
For me, I first of all, I like, I think spending time with people that make you feel comfortable, spending time with people that or you understand. I mean, I think the beauty of documentary film is showing people a world that they don't necessarily get to see, meeting people you don't get to necessarily see. And so that's what I wanted to do. I was fascinated by this idea of people taking the law into their own hands. And I think what we see in Arizona, what we see in Mexico, is that everyone has their own motivations. Everyone has their own complex motivations. Some of them, perhaps, are angry about immigration, and that's why they're there. Tim Naylor Foley, he himself says, he went down there originally to stop the flow of illegal immigrants from coming across their border. But slowly over time, he realized that the real enemy was not them, but the drug cartels that were controlling them. And so, I am not advocating for what they're doing. I wanted to document what they're doing and see for myself, what was happening along our border. And I think it's really easy in a radio studio to judge what's happening on the border. I think it's really easy to judge what's happening in Mexico, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to get beyond the headlines, put myself right in the middle of the action on the ground and see for myself what was happening.
Well, the very fascinating aspect of your documentary that we get very little insight into in the United States is what's happening on the other side of our border, which is what you show in Mexican cities with ordinary Mexicans who are arming themselves to protect themselves from the drug cartels. And I think there's not as much known about this here in the U.S. The Autodefensas, led by a charismatic doctor named Manuel Mireles, whose trust I'm guessing you also had to work to gain. Tell us a little bit about him and how you convinced him to let you follow him around with a camera.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I first stepped foot in Mexico and Michoacan, I think what I was really struck by was the suffering of everyday people, the suffering of people, living under the rule of the cartel. They really lived in a society where institutions had failed. The very institutions that were there to protect them were either not there, or they were there, working in collusion with the cartel. And so, this movement, this citizen movement, filled with, farmers, storekeepers, lawyers, all sorts of people, rose up to basically protect their town, to protect their families. And the leader of the group that emerged was this guy, Jose Manuel Morales, known as El Doctor, who's a small-town physician, and, very charismatic and complicated and interesting man.
And essentially what this group of mostly men that he leads is doing is taking back cities and towns one by one from the control of the cartels because the military or the local police have either failed to protect them or often are in cahoots with them. How did they do this? I mean, they literally armed themselves. They're wearing flak jackets. They trained themselves. It was remarkable, the scenes that you captured where they are confronted by the military in one town, but then call on the people to push the military out. That was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of amazing scenes. I'm not a war reporter. I've never been in situations like this before, but this film led me into some, wild places. I was in shootouts between the cartel and the vigilantes. In meth labs, as we discussed, in the dark desert night, in places of torture. And this film evolved in a way that I never could have dreamed of or predicted or imagined. And, this scene in particular you're talking about, in which the army surrounds the vigilantes as they're trying to take a town. They disarm them. And then the townspeople come in and surround the army and basically kick out the army. It was really sort of a almost dizzying place to shoot because the allegiances were so unclear. When I first stepped foot down there, I thought I was telling this very simple hero-villain story of guys in white shirts fighting against guys in black hats.
The white-shirted ones being the community defense folks, and then the black hats being the drug cartels.
Correct. And then over time, I realized that the lines between good and evil were much more blurry. Much more gray, and that grayness, that blurriness fascinated me. I really wanted to understand. I almost became obsessed with trying to understand, what was really happening, who these guys really were, where is this movement going.
And did you understand it? Did you come to any clarity?
Wow, what do you think?
I suppose people will have to watch the film to come to their conclusions. It's called Cartel Land, and I'm speaking with the filmmaker, Matthew Heineman. You referred to seeing people's pain, and there's a scene pretty early on in the film of a funeral. And these are the folks who are directly impacted personally through their families by the cartel's violence. I mean, here in the United States and even close to the border, no one's gunning down Americans, but Mexicans are the ones that are being gunned down en masse, killed, tortured, disappeared. The pain, particularly of women, of mothers, was pretty profound. And how does that pain get translated into the anger then that drives these self-defense groups, right? Because it's also a scary thing to have your own vigilante force, but are people just desperate? Do they feel like they have no other choice but to defend themselves?
Yeah, I mean, they for years, lived under this terror, and finally, they had enough of it, and so they rose up to fight back. It was self-preservation. It was a desire to bring sort of order to chaos, peace to terror, and get rid of this, Knights Templar. And for a while there, they were doing that. They're successfully getting rid of them. But as it did so, they created this power vacuum. And within this power vacuum, somebody needed to fill it. And that's where the film started to get complicated and interesting. And in some ways, we saw the cycle repeat itself.
What was the opinion of Tim Naylor Foley, who is the Arizona vigilante here in the U.S.? What was his opinion of the self-defense groups inside Mexico?
He actually looked at them with admiration. He really admired what they were doing. He thought they were heroes, standing up and fighting back.
And I'm wondering also, in telling a story like this, how important is it for Americans who are consuming the meth and also whose border policies very much trickle down and impact what's happening inside Mexico, for us to see this story, much more so than for Mexicans to see this story?
Yeah, look, I mean, this film is not a policy film. There's no talking heads, there's no government officials, there's no, outside experts. I really wanted to tell a visceral, emotional, personal story of how this narco violence affected everyday people, and then the response of everyday people rising up to fight back, and then the ramifications when armed groups rise up, as we've seen. That happened throughout history. We see that happening all across the world today. We'll continue to see that happen. So this idea of what happens when men and women take the law into their own hands was something that fascinated me, and the ramifications of that fascinated me. And so that's why I made this film. But for Americans, I really hope that this film shows them a world that they've never seen before. Shows them that there's this war that's happening in the country just south of us. A war in which 80,000 people have been killed. 20,000 people have been disappeared, gone. And, this is a war that we're connected to. This is a war that we're funding. We're consuming the drugs that are the basis for this war and the basis for this violence. It's obviously not that simple. But I want to show people how this is affecting everyday people on the ground.
You put yourself in situations that were pretty life-risking. You could have gotten into serious trouble at any given point in this. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on that.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not a war reporter, and I've never been in situations like this. So it was an absolutely terrifying film to make. At every moment, it was a really scary film to make, especially as the film progressed, especially as the lines between good and evil became more blurry. I could be on an aperitivo, on a mission with these guys at the end of the film, and I really, truly didn't know if I was with the good guys or the bad guys, and that was a really scary thing. But I think, for me, despite the more adrenaline moments, despite the shootouts and the interrogation scenes and the torture and the meth lab and all these very intimate, intense moments in the film, for me the most affecting moment was an interview that I did with a young woman whose whole family, who was kidnapped by the cartel along with her husband, and she witnessed him being chopped up to pieces in front of her and then burned to death. And to see this woman who's in the same room as me, and to look at her, and to look into her eyes, almost as if her soul had been sucked out of her. She had these very deeply hollow eyes. And to think that we're the same species of human beings that would do that to other people, that mentally, psychologically stuck with me much more so than anything else.
And then, of course, shooting a film is part one, putting it together is part two, deciding what to keep in and what to take out is a huge portion of filmmaking that often, those, of course, viewers never really get to experience. How did you go through that process? Was there something you left out that you wish you could have kept in for reasons of length?
I mean, we shot over 500 hours of footage, and the movie's 100 minutes. So
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot that we left out. But I think the essence of everything that we shot is there. Obviously the best scenes are there. I think my mantra in the edit room was let's let the audience go on this journey that I went on. The film was incredibly unpredictable. The film took many twists and turns. It was a roller coaster, and all those moments that I felt the rug was pulled out from under me, all those moments where I felt I understood what was happening, or I thought I understood our characters and things changed. I want the audience to feel those moments, where the rug is pulled out from under them.
How big was your crew?
We had it depended on where we were, what we were doing, but generally 2 to 4 of us.
So not that big.
Not that big, no. I mean, an amazingly talented shooter with me, Matt Porwall, shot, a lot of the film with me. I shot, most of the verite and the, shootouts and other things. So it was, being behind the camera for me actually calmed me down in a lot of these situations. Focusing on exposing, focusing on just the craft of filmmaking. Making sure that the record button was on. Just calm me down in a lot of these intense situations that I found myself in.
Did you wear a flak jacket?
Of course. Yeah. Although in that first shootout, I wasn't wearing one because it was one of those days when we didn't think anything was going right. Anything was going on, and it was 100 or so degrees. We were at a car dealership, literally, where one of the vigilante commanders was trying to buy a car, and so it seemed like absolutely nothing was happening. And so I took it off for a second. Just to air it out, because you're not supposed to wear it at all times. And then suddenly, boom, they get a call saying they know where these 2 assassins are. And they all jump in a car, and I jumped in with them. And, 5 minutes later, I was in the middle of a shootout between the cartel and the vigilantes.
What's your next project, Matthew?
I have a few different films I'm developing right now. Nothing
as dangerous as this
Hopefully
one?
nothing as dangerous. Hopefully nothing has changes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Best of luck to you.
Thank you so
do you have
much.
a website for Cartel Land you'd like to give
It's
out?
cartellandmovie.com. It opened last week in New York, and it's opening across the country this weekend, including here in LA at the ArcLight. I'll be doing Q&As with Josh Brolin on Friday night and Catherine Bigelow on Saturday night.
And we'll post that information to our website. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Matthew Heineman is the director and producer of Cartel Land, which is being released in theaters now around the country. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor and research intern. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.